All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our webinar on multi-cloud and how would you implement cybersecurity as part of that. So today we are talking a little bit about a specific case, but also talking in general about how you would do something similar to this in your own environment. Whether you have the same challenges or some of those same challenges, will give you some ideas on what you might be able to do on your own. Briefly, my name is Matti Suominen. I have been hosting many of the webinars here at Nixu, and I've been involved with the topic quite a bit. But it's my pleasure today to talk to somebody who actually knows what they're talking about. So why don't you briefly introduce yourself?
Hey, great. Thanks, Matti. I'm Teemu Kääriäinen from the Nixu Cloud Security Business Unit. I'm an AWS certified solution architect and security specialist, so that kind of makes me a strong believer in the capabilities of public cloud platforms to basically enable our customers to build secure, robust, scalable cloud-based solutions. And great to be here. And basically, today's discussion will be around the ways how we enable our customers to secure their entire cloud transformation, starting from the security requirements, from the secure cloud design to the implementation and all the way to the operations.
So briefly, I guess many of you know Nixu in general, and I guess we have worked together with many of you. But just briefly, Nixu is a cybersecurity company, and we are doing a lot in terms of what goes to cybersecurity. So cloud obviously is a big theme today. We are helping our clients both secure their cloud setups, evaluate them, build them, just about everything around that topic. And then access management, obviously a big topic as well. So there's a lot of things going on around the cloud themes. So let's jump into that and have a brief discussion about what all of this is. But before we jump into that, let me go through some practicalities. So as you know, there's a way to ask questions from us. Today we actually have more time than usually. So my usual spiel is that we only have 30 minutes, and out of that we lose 5 in the introduction. So we usually don't have time. Today we have 50 minutes. Hopefully that should be enough time to actually go into questions and maybe stray a little bit from what we originally planned to talk about. So having said that, definitely do ask questions. I will be taking those, and we will be taking those along the way, and we will have some time at the end to go through those. So definitely submit them using the question functionality. I will be looking at them and picking up the interesting ones that we can jump into. Also, if there's some questions that are maybe too broad or complicated or whatnot to actually make it into this one, we will follow up in some form. So let's see what that might be. But yeah. So let's jump to our case. I can briefly talk about this and then give you the turn to go into details. But basically, our story starts from the usual problem that a lot of our clients, as many of you, I'm sure, have been moving into cloud and starting to use different cloud platforms. And generally what happens is that you start with the idea of using one, and then you realize, if your organization is fairly large, you realize that suddenly you are actually using all of them, or at least many of them. So you have teams that might adopt the cloud platforms they prefer, or maybe there's a vendor that just likes using one cloud platform and there's another vendor who likes using a different one. Or maybe there's some strengths in each of those and you want to use them for that reason. Regional clouds being a good example of this. So a lot of the time then the challenge comes that how do you actually secure this kind of a mishmash of different clouds? I mean, securing just one cloud is a challenge on its own. And now you have 10 different clouds to deal with, and 5 of which you didn't actually know that you are using.
Yeah, and even these individual cloud platforms can basically grow very complex, especially from the security organization point of view. There is a real need to offer both visibility and the ability to enforce a certain security baseline across accounts or across subscriptions, so that you can basically effectively govern these kind of environments.
Yeah, I think this is something that especially people who are not familiar with how clouds work in practice, so they know the term and they generally know what it means. I think it's not always clear that when somebody says that the organization is using AWS or using Azure, it's not like there is one place that you log in and all the assets of the company are there and it's all meshed out in that's usually not what happens. So the whole term subscription, maybe you can briefly open up what that usually means in this kind of context.
Yeah, so basically there's the same term basically resides in multiple cloud platforms. So in AWS we usually talk about accounts. So an individual account is basically individual environment for a certain service or certain project, and it's either a production or QA or test account. So basically there's a need to distinguish with different types of environments through different accounts.
Yeah.
The same applies basically in the Azure side. So Azure talks about subscriptions. Allium talks about accounts as well. And basically the public cloud platforms, they offer the capabilities to manage these multi-account environments, where basically, for instance, in the AWS side, you have the control tower, which basically provides the kind of AWS best practices out of the box, so that you can get many of the security capabilities that are basically defined in the AWS well-architected framework directly built into your multi-account environment. And this is the kind of setup that you usually start with, that you have to have a capability to manage the complexity. And this is usually where the cloud service providers come into picture. So they are usually the organizations or companies that help their customers to manage their cloud environments, to enforce the processes. And they may have their own ways how to manage these multi-account environments, so they can utilize some of these services that are directly provided by the cloud platforms.
Sure, and definitely, so it's a complicated world. So let's jump briefly into what kind of starting point we're working with. In this particular case, the challenge comes from the fact that there's a lot of different cloud platforms being used. So again, sometimes you see only one. That might be the case. Anytime you go for a slightly bigger organization, I would say most of them have more than one cloud somewhere in there.
Yeah, that's quite a common scenario. And basically, if you start with the security requirements that the security organization quite often puts in place, those are usually provided in quite a high level, so that they are kind of cloud platform agnostic guidelines how to implement security. And there's basically a need to look at the concrete ways how the controls can be implemented with the cloud platform specific capabilities. And there's some variation obviously on the capabilities that different cloud platforms provide as native services to implement these technical controls. But from the security organization point of view, there's really a need to have a uniform kind of capabilities across cloud platforms.
Yeah. So I guess giving a typical example, so most organizations would have some kind of requirements for, usually before the cloud, this would be for servers and data centers and so forth. You would have requirements on general level about, for example, authentication. So there is a requirement saying that you need to be able to authenticate users on a very basic level, and there might be more advanced requirements to be able to identify some special users, administrative users, for example. Maybe there needs to be a stronger authentication in place. So typically most organizations would have something like this in place. So you have a list of requirements. What a cloud, of course, makes it difficult is that you cannot just take that list and map it. Well, you can, but you have to do the figuring out of, what does this mean in the context of any given cloud?
Yeah, so there seems to be kind of a native gap between the security organization and their way of whether they use like ISMS, like ISO 27K, or any other kind of organizational security policy as the basis to enforce security requirements on cloud platforms, and the actual development teams and kind of teams that develop the services. So there is a gap in the communication, and there's really a need to kind of close the gap in the way that you can take the individual security requirements that originate from the security organization and provide kind of tangible technical controls how to fulfill those requirements, so that the development teams and the operations are basically capable of handling those and are basically utilizing familiar technologies and this kind of way to have a way to deploy it effectively.
Yeah, and I guess the challenge, of course, is that when we go to cloud, you still have the same requirements, of course, in place, but then the question becomes that what exactly do I need to enable? What exactly do I need to use? Which service do I need to take into use, or which option I need to turn on to actually implement this requirement?
Yeah.
So it's not really useful to say that you need to implement multi-factor authentication without saying that in the context of this cloud, that means this service, or in the context of this cloud, there is not exactly a clear match, but in here it's actually done a little bit differently. So there's something comparable to that.
Yeah. So basically, there's a multitude of sources for the requirements. So obviously, the ones from the governance point of view we already went through. So there might be ISO 27K or such, but there's basically also the cloud platforms themselves. Basically do a lot of work to define their best practices, how to integrate security to the entire delivery of the cloud solution. So starting from the requirements all the way to the operations.
Yeah.
And in the AWS side, it materializes really through the AWS well-architected framework that kind of quite nicely divides this big pile of security requirements into quite manageable set of kind of high-level topics. So there's obviously identity and access management related requirements, and best practices, how to implement those, like you mentioned about the need for the multi-factor authentication. There's need for identity management, so managing the entire life cycle of the identities of the administrative users and so on. There's one section about the detective controls, so how do you get visibility at all layers basically to your cloud setup, so that you can ensure that there are necessary technical controls in place to protect your environments and to actually be alarmed about any security anomalies or events taking place.
Yeah.
There's the usual suspects of the data protection, infrastructure protection. Those basically have a wide set of different controls that the public cloud platforms provide. And finally, there's the incident response. So basically, when actually security events or anomalies take place, how do you take action? How do you ensure that the party who is responsible for managing the security incidents actually has the necessary access and has the necessary expertise to actually mitigate these attacks?
And I guess then, of course, the challenge is that if we were dealing with a situation where we would be fully, let's say, AWS native, for example, that would be the only cloud we use. So now that's slightly less of a challenge. We just go and we enable those features. We can, when we talk to each other, it's in terms of what AWS offers to us. So we can just say that, you know, enable this feature in AWS, and that means something to both of us because we both work with it. But let's say I work with Azure and you work with AWS, and there's some person who doesn't really work with either one of those.
Yeah.
So now the challenge is that I want to implement a multi-factor authentication on my side. You want to do the same, and the third person wants to do it in some other cloud platform.
Yeah.
So how do we tackle this? Because now it's no longer the same feature. You mentioned that there's a lot of these good features there. They have been defined by many of the platform owners, but at the same time, they are not the same ones.
Yeah.
So
basically, if you look at the individual security capabilities that the AWS offers, you quite often find the equivalent in the Azure side. And same applies to Allium, same applies to the GCP.
Yeah.
And basically, when AWS has the AWS well-architected framework, Azure has the Azure architecture framework that basically splits down the kind of best practices into similar kind of entities that the AWS well-architected defines. So basically, you can find equivalents between these different cloud platforms in the ways how individual security requirements can be fulfilled. You cannot really get away with the fact that you need people who have deep technical understanding of the cloud platform. So when you're building, you're integrating security to the entire life cycle of your cloud delivery, you have to have an understanding about the technical controls that are specific to that cloud. So,
yeah, sure.
So obviously you could take some third-party solution that would offer kind of multi-cloud management capability for the security, but that quite often either it lacks transparency in the way that what kind of controls it's actually using, or it stays in a very high level and doesn't necessarily go down so that it would cover all of these areas that basically, for instance, the AWS well-architected framework security pillar outlines.
Sure, and I guess it's also worth pointing out that when you have this sort of general approach to everything, it of course has to be a kind of subset of the features that everything implements. So it cannot have something where Azure or AWS would have a unique advantage. So you're basically missing out on all the best parts of each cloud if you go with some solution that kind of provides a common baseline without actually using the best features of each. So I'm not sure if that's also, that might be for some case, might be a good solution, but at the end of the day, usually there's a good reason why you are using those clouds. It is not just to have more cloud, it is usually to have some of the features offered by them.
And I'm basically a strong believer of cooperation, so that basically the party who is responsible of the security baseline and for the responsible of the security visibility needs to be in cooperation, first of all, with the cloud service provider, so that there's a common way to define how the baseline is deployed across environments, so that it doesn't conflict with anything that the cloud service provider does. And one important aspect is also the cooperation with the development teams and the operations teams, because they are basically responsible of the business that basically is offered through the public cloud platforms, and basically getting their acceptance for the baseline and the ways how it's deployed is absolutely necessary, and it requires integration with CI and CD platforms that are in place, with the ways how you do DevOps processes, and also being aligned with the possibly existing baselines that the cloud service provider may have in place.
So that basically covers the challenge part of it. So obviously we need to find a way to map what we are requiring from the cloud or our infrastructure in general. It doesn't necessarily only apply to the cloud. So we have a set of requirements. We need to understand what that means in the context of each cloud. So there needs to be a mapping between here's what we are asking and here's how to do it in this specific cloud. But I guess then there's a second part to this challenge. So obviously that if you did that, you would already have a good baseline of how to actually set things up. Then we come to the other end of the challenge. So obviously there's going to be situations where things are not done correctly. For whatever reason. It might be somebody messed up, somebody didn't do it. There is a huge variance between how the different cases are deployed. There might be teams that are doing a better job, a worse job. So obviously we need some way to go back and look and say, okay, this is what we plan to do. We plan to deploy this in such a way. We plan to put these settings on. Did we actually do it? So somehow we need to go and see. And here's where we come to the challenge also that, because these are complicated environments. So there might, as you mentioned, there might be any number of different accounts that are working slightly differently. Maybe they were set up slightly differently by different people. You know, again, some did better job than others. So
there's basically multiple ways how you can tackle these kind of problems. So some of them are kind of general in the form of design principles that you apply to cloud environments. So first of all, you want to have high level of automation. You don't want to be deploying the baseline manually. You want to use your multi-account management system to basically ensure that you have the same baseline deployed across accounts, and you want to build automation for that. Obviously, there may be different tool sets that, for instance, the cloud service provider or the customer already uses. We have been kind of in the situations we mostly use kind of native capabilities, CloudFormation templates, Azure Resource Manager templates, but there may be Terraform, Salt, CDK kind of tools utilized. The second point is really the continuous improvement. so you cannot do everything at once.
Sure.
But you have to learn from the mistakes and learn from the incidents so that you can gain better visibility to the security anomalies. You may want to deploy new controls. You want to take into use new services as the whole security landscape of AWS or Azure evolves over time. So they basically introduce new security services all the time, and you may want to consider taking these into use. And finally, you obviously want to have kind of visibility at all layers. So the same way how you are doing operational excellence, basically building resilient environments in the cloud, apply the same approach also for the security controls.
All right. So that maybe opens up the challenge a little bit. So we are tackling with a couple of problems. First of all, knowing what the baseline actually is. So based on our requirements, whatever we happen to be using, what needs to be done in any given cloud or in all the clouds, depending on what we're using. Could be that your company is doing one only, could be that you are using all of them or anything in between. But then also having that sort of visibility on the, first of all, how do you deploy it, and then how do you know that everything actually went the right way. I guess you can tell what's your experience on this. So back in the good old days of actual physical hardware and so forth, it wasn't that uncommon for the sort of baseline to drift a little bit.
Yeah.
You would end up in the environment starting in a good shape, and then maybe, you know, as time went on, things were not exactly, somebody made a slight change here, slight change there.
Yeah, and there's really need for flexibility with the baseline, and especially through the parameterization. So basically, it should provide additional value for all of the organizations. So basically, some of those may be kind of in their first steps of the cloud transformation, so that basically they don't necessarily have very mature cloud security operations processes and procedures defined. So for those kind of organizations, it should provide kind of an easy way to integrate the most important security controls to your deployment model, and to basically kind of start up with a setup that has the security built in. It needs to support also the organizations that may have very mature cloud security processes in place. So it should either ease the burden of the operational teams in their side to basically focus on other parts. So having the possibility to have the security part covered with the common baseline, or some other requirements that may originate from the fact that we basically have multiple sources for the security requirements.
Sure. So let's jump a bit into how we actually started tackling this issue, and what would be a good approach for any company really to take. So this is of course not unique in any way to this given scenario, but this is something that basically you could do in any situation. So we basically started implementing a continuous monitoring for this kind of setup. And in order for you to be able to do that, it sounds really simple. I mean, you just have a way of continuously checking what the situation is. It sounds really simple, but then a lot goes into having that in place. It's not just a matter of turning it on and then getting it.
Yeah.
So you have to actually do a lot of work beforehand. Again, if you only had one platform, I guess this would be a bit easier, but then especially when you have multiple clouds that you are using, and you want to make sure that you are aligning them with your requirements. So again, if you are requiring, as an example, multi-factor authentication, or if you are requiring that there must be a monitoring and logging happening somewhere, you must get an audit log somewhere, you have to first of all understand what that means in context of any given cloud you're using, and then making sure that it is actually turned on in every single place that it needs to be turned on.
Yeah.
So you want to start by basically saying, okay, so where do you start? I mean, I have here now let's say I'm using ISO 27000 as my framework, and somehow I want to turn these fairly high level requirements that are really not specific to cloud at all. They don't say anything about AWS features or anything of such. So where should I start? This is literally all I have right now, and my desire is to use all the clouds I can get my hands on.
Well, I think you have made a good decision of integrating security to the entire life cycle of your cloud transformation. So basically, this is familiar stuff to you. So secure development lifecycle just applied in a cloud environment.
Sure.
You start with the requirements. You basically have some kind of either a regulatory framework, some ISMS framework, or some other internal security policies that whose requirements you need to fulfill.
Sure.
And these basically differ for each organization. Some organizations may have quite well-defined processes, how their ISMS is managed. Some may have fewer requirements, but basically this is the basis. There's also the cloud platform specific requirements, like I mentioned, the AWS well-architected and Azure architecture framework that acts as the requirements that you need to input, and they overlap in many areas with the requirements that come from the kind of traditional security requirements frameworks. And finally, I'm also a strong advocate of using threat modeling and risk analysis as methods to basically kind of enforce risk-based decision making to the process so that you actually focus to the actual threats that are relevant to your environment.
Couldn't really agree more. And I think often when there's a discussion about threat modeling or different types of risk assessment schemes that might be out there, I think unfortunately very often they are decoupled from the actual work. So you have a group of people or a person or a team doing a threat model, and they identify all these good things that we need to defend against. This is what could go wrong. But then there's this kind of disconnect from that point into the actual what do we do on the defense side of things. And I think that's where it kind of goes wrong too often. We don't really use the information we just learned. We know exactly what we are and are not worried about. And then we sort of throw that all away, put it into the binder and say, okay, now let's go and implement the generic controls.
Yeah, that's true. I see kind of the risk assessments, the risk analysis and threat modeling kind of as one input to the security requirements. So the controls are basically the same that you may have in your internal security requirements or in the cloud platform specific best practices. So it kind of builds up a pool of controls that you need to implement. And when you have an understanding about the requirements that are relevant to your environment, then you can start actually mapping those to the technical controls. And they are fairly straightforward because basically all of the platforms, whether it's AWS, whether it's Azure, whether it's Alium, they basically provide ways how you can implement detective controls to your cloud platform setup. Those are actually the ones that we prefer. They basically provide minimal disruption for the cloud deployment teams. So basically they are just there reporting, providing visibility to the level of compliance. There's quite often also the possibility of integrating auto remediation capabilities to the actual compliance monitors. So if non-compliance is basically observed, there may be, for instance, in AWS side, a Lambda function that gets initiated that actually corrects the situation and actually puts the setup back to a compliant state. But you may have, I would be little bit cautious with these because basically you may have on the other side your CI and CD setup that messes up the thing again.
Yeah, and they start fighting.
Yeah.
Yes, for sure. And I could see that going wrong in some cases where the change was actually deliberate. So somebody needed to do it, and now that person is fighting the automation that is trying to turn it back off. So
yeah, and there needs to be enough flexibility also in the baseline so that you can handle these kind of non-compliant situations, because you don't want to have a situation where the normal is that you have 50 non-compliant resources or you're non-compliant with 10 rules all the time. You want to basically, if you have good reasons why you are non-compliant, you have to have also the capability to either disable those or parameterize them so that you become compliant.
Yeah. So that basically takes us through the basic idea. So we try to map whatever requirements we have. We try to map those into capabilities on each cloud. And then we can use that as designed in each cloud to figure out what the situation is and so forth. And I think there's definitely beauty in just using whatever is already provided, because now we don't have that problem of not using the features and functionalities that we actually wanted to use in the first place.
Yeah.
So we get to use all the good features of each cloud. And if some cloud does something better than others, or there is a good way of implementing something, we don't have to throw that away.
Yeah.
Just to get some kind of baseline.
And there may be actually even controls implemented in some of the development teams that they are utilizing on a regular basis. So having kind of a common platform where you can take these good items and basically make them usable across the whole organization is kind of a good way. So we're strong promoters of the native capabilities that the public cloud platforms offer to build kind of continuous compliance monitoring. So there are kind of similar capabilities in AWS side. It's usually AWS config. In Azure side, we deal with Azure policies, and in the Allium side, we deal with their cloud config service. And basically, all of those provide more or less similar kind of capabilities in terms of getting visibility to the compliance level.
Sure.
Then what you do with the actual findings that come from the observations on non-compliance is another factor. So when you have an understanding about the requirements and the associated technical controls, then you have utilized your multi-account environment with the parameterization support to deploy the baseline across your accounts or subscriptions, and you're collecting feedback and you're continuously improving your baseline. The final step is actually the kind of obviously having situational awareness. How compliant are you across accounts, but also doing something about the findings. So in the AWS side, for instance, the security hub is quite a good place where to actually control the flow of the security findings from the cloud environment to the security operations center and to the CM solution. So it provides a way to basically take full advantage of the security capabilities that are provided by the cloud platform, whether it's guard duty in the AWS side or the Azure security graph, providing the kind of, in a way, pre-processed security events for the CM solution and all the way to the security operations center.
So I think one beauty of this way, and this kind of comes back, so last week we discussed vulnerability scanning and how that works. So I think especially there, back in the old days, one huge challenge was always getting, there was somebody using the scanner, and then there was somebody maintaining the servers, and these were generally never the same people. So you had somebody checking, and that was maybe the security team or some operational team, and then you had some other people fixing the issues, and usually you had miscommunication between them. They just didn't get done. So I think one of the beauty of this is that this is actually putting the security where the cloud stuff is happening. This is not introducing a new cloud security team that is doing some sort of security magic, and then there's the other cloud people who are doing something completely different. This is actually giving them tools to do this on their own and actually be part of this change.
Yeah, and integrating the entire security organization, including the security operations center, to the process of protecting the cloud environments.
Yeah, so I think that's definitely one of the huge benefits of this sort of approach. We are now using the tools these people are using anyway. They have the skills, they have the knowledge of using them to start with. So it's not like we are introducing a new sort of security thing and just sending everybody the training saying that here's a new security thing that you now need to also use. And then you get the pushback of, well, no, because I'm using whatever I'm using, and then the Azure team is using something else. No, it's more like, let us introduce the small bit of new technology into what you are already doing and make your life a little bit easier.
Yeah, and there's basically full transparency to the components that are being deployed. So there's obviously always the possibility for the cloud teams to have a look at the templates that are used in the deployment. So what is actually being deployed? What is the cost impact to your cloud operations? And basically how to improve the baseline internally, how to contribute new capabilities. And these are familiar technologies that these have been implemented with. In AWS side, it's mostly config rules, it's Lambda functions, these kind of capabilities that the development teams actually use on a daily basis to either operate their cloud environments or to implement new capabilities to their platform.
So let's jump into a couple of topics that kind of relate to all of this. So obviously when we did this and when we have done this kind of work, every case is a little bit different. So there might be then other companies that do it slightly differently, or they might have their own constraints. So here's a couple that might be interesting. Obviously there might be some existing baselines already at play. So what can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so basically nowadays you never start in a basic greenfield. So there's existing accounts, existing subscriptions, existing processes in place.
Yep.
And basically always there is some sort of a cloud service provider for the organization providing support for the management of and operations of the cloud environments. So the baseline needs to fit to the processes that the customer and the cloud service provider have in place. Quite often the cloud service providers have their own baselines. So basically when they use the multi-account management system to create, for instance, new AWS accounts, whether it's through the AWS tooling like Control Tower or Landing Zone, or through their own tools and processes, they have some sort of a baseline. And there is a need to ensure that there's no overlap, so that you don't unnecessarily pay for controls that have been already done by the cloud service provider, and so that the roles and the responsibilities are clear, and that the baseline naturally integrates to the existing setup.
So then there's the different needs that we actually briefly mentioned already before, that there are teams, there are applications, there are use cases where that one baseline isn't actually going to be enough. So for example, you might run into something like specific controls need to be tighter with your critical applications, but then you have some cases where that's too much maybe. Or you don't want to enable all the features everywhere. Maybe there's cost reasons. There could be any number of things that you want to keep this different. So how would you address that? Would you just change the baseline? Would you implement different baselines? What would be a good solution there?
Yeah, the approach that we've taken is usually parameterization. So basically, over time, evolving the baseline so that it addresses the needs of the different teams. They usually utilize quite different technologies when deploying solutions. So some of the some of the teams may be fully tied to virtual machine-based, quite traditional infrastructure as a service based setups. Some may be using containerized environments, and some may use fully serverless setups. Basically, the baseline should offer capabilities for all of those. And for instance, considering, for instance, AWS-based environments, Inspector is the kind of managed vulnerability management service that can perform scans against virtual EC2 virtual machines. So you don't necessarily want to have that running when your setup is fully built on serverless functionalities. But instead, you want to enable some of the controls that are specific to the Lambda functions, so that they are deployed correctly and their placement in the VPC is correct, and so on.
And I guess it also makes sense then to make sure that, as you mentioned earlier, that whatever the rules for any given setup are, so whatever needs to be on, whatever needs to be off, there isn't a situation where some of those controls are failing, but we sort of agree and we know that they should be failing. So it shouldn't be like that, where there's like sort of known reds in a way, because that creates the problem that now nobody has any idea what should be green, what should be red, because any given time there might be a good reason why something is red. So a red should always mean a problem, not a we agreed that this is red. That's a bad way to do it. So then, of course, the deployment part is the last one. So again, usually when we deal with something, the different companies, they have their own ways of doing the deployments. Maybe that's consistent, maybe that is not. But how would you say, for example, if different companies start doing this and they have whatever CI/CD pipelines that they are using, how does that play into the whole thing?
The biggest benefits can be achieved if this is integrated tightly with the existing CI and CD capabilities. And basically, since we are building with the kind of native capabilities from deployment point of view, whether the customer is actually using like GitLab CI or Jenkins or Azure DevOps or AWS Code Pipeline, whatever the technology is, basically it should be quite natural to integrate these capabilities to those pipelines. And also at the same point, also raise the awareness of integrating other security controls to the pipelines to basically enable this kind of a SecDevOps type of model of operations. And well, this is quite a familiar area, obviously, to you. So
sure, and in any case, I think it's always makes sense, especially today, as this kind of agile development model and all that comes with it is becoming the norm in a lot of places. Tying this into the automation of, you know, when you create a server or when you create a system somewhere, all the baselines gets applied, all the checks get made, rather than having somebody sort of chase after it.
Yeah.
Because that's a silly idea. So if you are having a good level of automation in creating systems, if you deploy something, it just automatically creates the servers for you. At that point, like, why would you have somebody sort of chase after and figure out what's happening where, rather than just building it as part of that deployment chain? This also comes back to the whole idea of, let's arm the people who are actually doing the work with the tools needed to do security. Let's not become a sort of separate function that is chasing after people and trying to figure out if they are doing security right.
Yeah, since basically the infrastructure as a code type of approach is kind of built into the development teams. They follow those principles already. So basically building on top of that capability makes it possible to basically have all of the security controls in the same pipeline that is used to deploy the kind of business side of the solution. And you can also utilize the same approach for the change management, for the release management, so that you have the review processes in place to basically see that you are not causing regression or breaking anything when deploying this.
For sure. We have a bit of time left, so let's discuss one more point that is interesting. So obviously now we have thought about, well, we have the baseline now, we have an understanding of how the requirements that we have, whatever they might be, how they map into controls in different environments. We have a good idea of you know, what the situation is. We could do a compliance scan. We can understand what the situation is. So then the last question, of course, is who is going to be following up on this? How do you actually do something when there's a problem? So this is always the challenge for anybody that is buying any sort of tool that is intended to scan something or validate something. You know, it's one thing to have that tool, and it's a completely other thing, you know, year after year, day after day, to actually follow up on those. So let's talk the monitoring bit for a little bit. So what do you think? Is it difficult, and what makes the whole cloud so difficult from the kind of traditional monitoring, the SOC perspective of implementing traditional monitoring?
Yeah, I see the SOC as an integral part of this entire cloud security, and they have an especially important role in the incident response. And the SOC needs to be really cloud enabled, so that they are familiar working with public cloud-based environments. They have the necessary tools, they have the necessary expertise to manage those, and they can interface with the different parties who are operating the cloud environments. And the challenge comes in many ways. Basically, SOC kind of providers are quite often familiar working with workstation-based environments or traditional virtual machine-based environments. The elasticity of the cloud is a challenge for them. They're basically, since you quite often want to build horizontal scalability so that you can actually address kind of peak business hours with additional resources, so resources come and go. The SOCs are quite often tied to IP addresses and agents being deployed.
And I would argue that a lot of security in general is built around that sort of idea.
Yeah.
The first question anybody's going to ask you is about assets and IP addresses and servers and applications running there. And this discussion is sometimes very difficult when you try to explain that I don't exactly know how many servers I have, and any answer I give you now might be wrong 5 minutes from now.
Yeah.
So it's not a relevant sort of paradigm to think it from the perspective of what servers do I have running, or would you like to inspect the servers that I have. I don't really care about those servers running right now.
Yeah.
Because I will have different set of servers in a moment.
Yeah.
That's not really like a sensible way to think about it.
Yeah. Second problem basically comes from the fact that the public cloud platforms basically provide very mature and very capable kind of services to perform threat detection and vulnerability management. So for instance, in the AWS side, the guard duty is basically capable of monitoring multiple log sources, finding security anomalies, taking advantage of the whole machine learning capabilities that AWS has built, and all of the kind of threat intelligence information that the AWS collects to produce findings.
Sure.
But the SOC is usually operating in a little bit different mode. So they usually get huge amount of information, different log sources. They basically normalize those, detect security anomalies out of those. So getting just pre-processed security events that AWS determined that something happened is not usually enough for them. So they usually still want the actual raw logs, whether it's the VPC flow logs or the CloudTrail logs, or so that they can basically get more information out of the actual
Exactly. So
finding.
It's a bit like having like a shadow SOC running there already.
Yeah.
That is sort of already doing what the SOC is supposed to be doing, and you don't really get the data that you need for analysis. You sort of get the pre-processed analysis results. Kind of. So at that point, then the question becomes that how do you tackle that? How do you dig deeper? How do you figure out if it's correct, if there's something more to it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of additional source of security events and anomalies. So obviously the SOC needs to kind of be part of the continuous improvement process. So they provide new capabilities over time, but take advantage also about these. And basically at the end of the day, this also boils down to the individuals. So having the necessary expertise, having the necessary knowledge of the cloud-based environments, practicing the security incident management processes, for instance, through game days, so that you actually feed the SOC with actual security anomaly information and see that the necessary access is in place so that the communications actually work between the cloud provider and the SOC organization and so on.
And I guess that's also a part of, and a challenge for us and something we've been building on when we are doing this kind of mapping and building the capabilities and tools, that interaction between that project, that process, and then the people on the SOC side who need to actually follow up. That's a crucial part of it. Otherwise, I mean, you have good detection capabilities, but at the end of the day, that's only as good as somebody who is actually acting on those.
Yeah. And
so let me check while we still have a brief moment of time, if there's anything particular. Let me check this one. It's always good that the questions are long. Yeah, so basically there's a question regarding the cloud platforms and requirements for those. So how much of it targets the platform itself and how much of it targets the applications running there. So what sort of ratio are we talking about, and basically how should the requirements be written?
Yeah, so obviously security controls need to be implemented in both levels. So we have been here mostly dealing with the platform side. Then if you, for instance, have a well-defined model how you deploy applications and services, let's say that you use Kubernetes or other containerization technology, to deploy your solutions. So obviously at that point, it becomes important that you would integrate kind of Kubernetes security controls to your baseline, so that when you have Kubernetes clusters in different accounts running, you can basically apply the SIS Kubernetes benchmark, for instance, across all of these.
Sure.
But for organizations who don't use Kubernetes, who, for instance, use fully virtual machine-based deployments or fully serverless deployments, for them, it's not so much necessary.
Yeah. And then, of course, the applications at the end of the day are a lot of where the security is happening. So what we focus today is mostly the platforms, but then when we think about if you deploy a business application there, that's a whole bunch of new things that are coming on top of that. Yeah. So the platform might be secure, the application is listened. So definitely the requirements need to cover both sides, and then you need to think about what can the cloud sort of give you for free and what can be implemented there. Identity access controls are a good example that sometimes might come from the cloud rather than the application.
Yeah.
But then you have business logic that is the domain of the application. You want to make sure that data is still being protected. You want to make sure that basically the application logic makes sense from security perspective. So that is something that is outside of the domain of I would say cloud services in general.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, it's just a way of hosting that application with additional nice bells and whistles, but at the same time, it is not going to be your business application.
Yeah. So you always need to adapt.
Sure.
But there may be capabilities. So if you look at from the threat modeling point of view, there may be a kind of thing that can be done is that you have a generic kind of, let's say, cloud platform agnostic threat model that applies to all of your services. And from there, you get the list of controls that you can apply also in the kind of application level. So it may be like web application firewalls or such.
So with that, we are unfortunately out of time again. Thank you, and thanks to everybody listening in. Hopefully this has been useful. And if there's any additional question that we didn't get to, we will definitely again follow up with those. There's going to be a blog post about this, and we will be following up anyway on the topic, because this is an ongoing effort in any way here at Nixu, something we run into all the time. So thank you, everybody, and it's been a pleasure as always.
Thanks.
Bye.